Good evening. This is Faith Matters, and I am David Hennessy. I would like to take up where we left off last week with my interview with Tim Francis. If by any chance you missed the program last week, you will find it on my podcast, Finding Happiness, on YouTube and Spotify.
The early Christians suffered a lot, and it wasn't because they invited evil in. There's going to be suffering, which I'm sure we can get into, redemptive suffering, right? I think we should talk about that eventually here. So, all right, so back to my story. So I was heavily addicted to this, and every single time, there's exceptions, that I would go out and we would have shots of alcohol and so on and so forth, immediately, again, the best analogy I can come up with is it's like you buried a bone in your backyard or put it under your couch, and your dog will not stop. He doesn't care about anything else around him until he gets that bone. Right. That's how it is when people are addicted. And it could be porn, it could be drugs, and as we said, it could be wealth, it could be real estate. I know you were a developer. It is a drug, right? And your focus is on that high, regardless of how it hurts you or hurts other people. And so this is what I was struggling with. And so what happened is, another significant moment, I moved from Ohio to Texas. I was chasing money. I wanted to get rich. And I know you can relate to that well, David. I've heard your story, which is amazing. And I was in a bar, and I met my wife. And of course, she wasn't my wife at the time, but I met who became my wife. And my wife had no religious upbringing. The people she hung out with were late-night party people. Now, the beautiful thing is my wife was not a partier. She was like the mother hen of the group. When my wife was 24, she'd already built her own house. So she was a very responsible, but she hung out in this, like she used to wear stuff to the bar you wouldn't wear to the beach, if you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And so she was a model. She was Miss Hawaiian Tropic. She traveled. She went to Mexico. I know that's where you lived for a while. She went there all the time. She got in all these contests, bathing suit contests, and they would, in Cancun, they would have all these contests, and she would win, and they would pay for her hotel. So she would get free hotel because she had a whole modeling crew that could win any bathing suit contest. So she had no religious background, but we met in a bar, and at one point we got invited to this big old mega church. Now, I want to say this. People say, how did you get rid of your addiction? And I say, you're never, there's always exceptions, but to me, you're never rid of it. It's just around the corner. Like evil wants to entice you, right? Because the whole goal, it deceives you because for a moment you feel great. but thereafter, anybody who's ever been addicted to cocaine knows you can spend hours staring at a wall after the high's gone and after your cocaine's gone. And anybody who's ever done that knows how miserable that is. And you say, well, why would you do it again? Well, how many times have you been drunk and puked and you woke up with a blasting headache and you said, never again, and a week later you're drinking, right? Because the mind is tricked. And it always remembers the high. The next day you remember the bad, but 3 days later, all you can remember is how good it felt. And unfortunately, with drug addiction, especially cocaine, especially crack, it's like a daily thing, especially if you're drinking. So I just want to say it's always out there, okay? It's not like, okay, I'm done. But I remember my wife and I got invited to a big old church. Now, David, it was not a Catholic church. It was what they call here is non-denominational, but they're really big churches, and they're not Catholic, and they're good people, and they're preaching about getting out of the world and all this kind of stuff. Well, I wasn't against it per se, but I hadn't been going to church for years. My wife had no religious upbringing, and here's what I wanted to know: well, how do I know this stuff is true? How do I know it's real? As far as I know, when I grew up, I believed in Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny. And I found out those weren't true. So to me, this whole story about Jesus is like the Easter Bunny or Santa Claus story, if that makes sense. And some people gave me some books, and I started listening to debates from people who were atheists and people who were Christians.
Wow.
And I was massively impressed. There's a one guy. His name's William Lane Craig, and he's debated all these atheists around the world. And I just was impressed that there was actual evidence that Jesus Christ was an actual historical figure. Forget the fact that he's God. We'll get into that in a minute. Just the idea that he existed, that he was real, and most importantly, that there was actual evidence for two things: miracles and his resurrection. And I'm not saying it's 100%. You know, you can't sit there and do it like a mathematical equation and say it's 100% proof. I would just suggest to anybody that the probabilities of it being true are incredibly large based upon evidence. So I remember going to that church and getting these books, and I thought, okay, and I called my mom. And David, like I said before, you stop me and bring me back to where I was before if I get off track here, okay?
Yeah, sure.
So my mom, remember, my mom's like a Mother Teresa, right? I remember I wrote a book about, from the crack house to God's house, the power of a mother's prayer. That's my mom. So my mom says, I just want you to know what you're giving up. What she was talking about was the Mass, the Catholic Mass. Now, I love my mom. She's the nicest lady in the world. But I thought, what in the world is she talking about? Like, what am I giving up? I went from the bar scene to the Bible scene, man. Now, by the way, there's nothing wrong with drinking, okay? There's no sin in having some alcohol, I mean, by any means. Where it goes wrong, like anything else, is when you don't do it in moderation. And I never did anything in moderation. I always wanted to do everything to the largest degree I could. Anyways, so what happened is, for my mom's sake, I decided to look into the differences between Catholics and non-Catholic Christians. I had come to believe the evidence for Jesus Christ was strong enough. I didn't need it overrode Buddhism, and I'm not against Buddhism or Hinduism or anything like that, but I'm just saying the evidence for those things is not like it is for Christianity. Christianity is the only religion in the world. And when there's people that say all religions are basically the same, and I don't mean this as offensive, but that's an ignorant thing to say, because the reality of there's only one person that claimed to be God historically. Buddha didn't claim to be God. Hindu didn't claim to be God. They just said, we'll lead you to truth. But this guy said, I am the truth. I am the way. No one goes to the Father except through me, and all these kind of things. So I decided to focus on the Christian faith, okay? And I wanted to know, how do I know which faith is which one, Catholic and non-Catholic, most represents the truth of what Jesus Christ taught? So how'd I do it? Again, I'm a sports guy, a party guy. I'm not some Bible guy. But to honor my mom, I wanted to look into this, and I started listening to debates, again, from Catholics and non-Catholics.
Uh-huh.
And again, I became completely convinced that the truth, the biblical and historical truth, was with the Catholics.
Well,
and then
so
something really
first you
significant.
found Christianity, were convinced that Christianity was the way, then you found the Catholic Church.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right. Now, it's interesting. I was at a bar. Let me backtrack a minute here. I was invited to go to a place in New York. This place is called Gaieties. Okay, it's closed down now, but it was famous. I'm talking about Madonna. I'm talking about Tom Cruise. All these people used to party there. Now, this is going to sound crazy to you, because it did to me. But what they had there, it was a gay club. Now, I'm not gay, okay, but it's a gay club, and they would have male models from all over the world, in particular Canada for some reason, and they would come in, and they would go in there, and they would entertain gay men, okay? And by the way, all these guys that were entertaining them were not gay, okay, that I knew. They were straight. But these men would pay them they would make $5,000 a week, okay? And they would just be seen with them. And these were really men that looked out of a magazine. Well, I used to be in that kind of shape, okay? And they asked me, invited me to be a part of that. Now, this is before my conversion. And I'm just sounds like a party. I'm not gay, but if I just got to hang out, as long as I don't got to do anything stupid, and they're going to pay me that kind of money, I'm in. So I went to New York for a week. This is all detailed in my book. And I got introduced to the most unbelievable underground. Just give you one example. So these guys, if you can imagine Arnold Schwarzenegger people, okay? I'm talking about the entertainers, okay?
Yeah.
And remember, they're not gay. And if you're gay, I'm not against you. I'm just telling you these guys weren't gay. But so they would invite this guy would invite them back to their place, and this guy would be dressed up in these crazy outfits, chains and all this stuff, and they would beat the crap out of this guy.
What?
And I mean to bloody pulp. And the guy would pay these big Arnold Schwarzenegger guys to beat the crap out of him, and I'm talking bloody, and that would get him off, the guy that paid him. And the reason I bring that up is because one perversion leads to another perversion, leads to another perversion, and one high leads to another high. And so I saw this underground world. I mean, you're talking married men, grandpas, coming into a gay bar and hiding it from their wife to see 20-year-old male models that they would pay thousands of dollars to just hang out with them.
Good
and
God.
this I never been. I mean, I grew up in a small country town, and here I am, but I remember the reason I bring this up because I remember they gave me mushrooms. No, not mushrooms. They gave me ecstasy. Okay, ecstasy. That was a big deal in Cancun too. It used to be.
Yeah.
And they call it Molly, ecstasy, whatever. And they gave me some. The entertainers were VIPs everywhere, and we went to this underground club, and I show it in my book. I think it was called Twilo. Yeah, Twilo. Top 10 clubs in the world at the time. Okay, I mean 10,000 square feet, and it's after hours, and they're VIP. So I remember getting into this club, and they gave me some ecstasy, and then I was in the bathroom, and these guys pulled out some white stuff, and I thought it was cocaine. But it was a thing called Special K. It's a cat tranquilizer. I know that sounds crazy. I didn't know. They offered it to me, and I'm stupid enough to take anything at that time, David. That's just the reality. And so I just wanted a big party. And I'll never forget, and there's a reason I bring this up. I remember, see, when you take something like mushrooms, which I did back in the day, you hallucinate. You see things.
Yeah.
Like visibly see things, right? It's called a trip. And it's one thing when you're expecting to have a trip, a hallucination. It's another thing when you have one and you're not expecting it.
Yes.
Okay?
Uh-huh.
And so I'm in this 10,000-foot underground club, and there's a tribal dance going around. I can't even explain all the stuff going on in there. And all of a sudden, I started hallucinating.
Good.
And I thought for sure these people were there to kill me. I thought 100%. I'm on this hallucination thing, and I thought that they're here to kill me. And I'll never forget looking at somebody, and I was staring right at somebody, and snakes started coming out of them. I mean as visibly as you can see yourself in the mirror, okay? There's snakes, and I don't mean a dream. I mean it. I see it. And then there's an Asian kid sitting about, 10 yards from me, out on this place where everybody was high in this underground club, and his head blew up like a humongous, huge, and started hissing at me.
Good God.
Now, I didn't know about the spiritual world back then. I just thought this just became really, really freaked out. Now, years later, I learned something. I learned what The Exorcist said, that the ancient Christians called drugs witchcraft, and that, you think about it, alcohol, they call it spirits, right? Spirits. And what happens is, The Exorcist says, when you take drugs and alcohol, that can be a direct link to a dark world.
Wow.
And I know for me, that's exactly what happened. One thing at a time, I was inviting evil in, right? Left and right. And it becomes to where your life becomes destroyed. I mean, anybody who's been addicted, I mean, just watch Intervention on TV, right? I mean, you see all the people who destroyed their life. The greatest American football players that ever existed, Lawrence Taylor, was highly addicted to crack cocaine and almost destroyed his life. So it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter how strong you are. It doesn't matter how rich you are or poor you are. In the hood, they call the crack pipe, they call it the devil's stick. That's where I'm from. That's what they called it in the hood, right? The devil's stick. Interesting, because that's exactly what it was.
Wow.
So I meet. I'm trying to give you a picture of what's going on, right? I mean, I'm struggling. I'm chasing money. I meet my wife, and even though she hung out with party people, she was kind of like the mother hen. She sees that, here's a guy. I brought her to meet my parents, and here's a kid that grew up right, and he's struggling big time. And we get invited to this big non-Catholic church. I start studying and finding out that, well, the Catholic faith is it's what the ancient Christians, it's how the ancient Christians, and I'm just going to back up real quick, and I'll finish that thought. If you're going to follow, this is how I thought, if I'm going to follow this thing called Christianity, I darn sure better know it's true. And how do you know anything's true? Well, I say evidence. By the way, this baloney going around that you can have faith or you can have evidence is ridiculous. There's no contradiction. You don't need to have blind faith. Now, the old people like my dad, they had blind faith, and God bless them. I mean, the Bible says, blessed are those who believe without seeing. But that's not me, brother. I need to see to believe, right? So evidence was really important. I'm not going to spend my weekend indoors with some priest or some talking about something, the Last Supper every weekend. I got more fun things to do with my time. That was my mindset. Yeah. So I through a whole bunch of evidence, I came to believe this stuff is actually real. Now, here's the biggest piece, which, we could talk for another hour about this piece. And if you got people listening, I can tell you, you want to tune in right now and hear this. Not because I'm talking, because nothing like this has ever been filmed in human history, ever. And you can watch it on my website. My mother, God bless her, sent me a tape. It was on the Fox news station back in 1999. It was a 2-hour documentary. And the person on this little show, which they had 29 million people watch the show back in 99. And the person on there he's the father of Australian investigative journalism. And he hated the Catholic Church with a passion. He didn't believe in God. I think somebody said he was voted richest 200 people in Australia. I mean, I'm talking, he had a show that came on called The Current Affair. If you Google him, his name's Mike Willesee. You can go to my website and see his stuff. This guy was the guy for investigating anything. Wars. He always was known as the hard man who would get to the bottom line. And his neighbor, his attorney, challenged him to use his investigative skills to prove something wrong. So what were they going to prove wrong? There's a lady who actually lives in Mexico. She's from Bolivia, Cochabamba, Bolivia. She goes back and forth, last I checked.
Yeah.
And where Yucatan, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you'll read about it on my website, and we'll give your listeners that, I'm sure. But the bottom line is, they said she was having the stigmata. Now, I didn't know what a stigmata was. In case there's some listeners that don't, stigmata means marks. And, in the Bible, Paul says, I bear the wounds of Christ. And it's considered a gift. Now, we'll get into that, I'm sure. But the bottom line is, a stigmata is where people actually manifest. They get the wounds of Christ in their hands, in their feet, on their side. They bleed, sometimes for hours. And for your listeners that might be freaked out by this, David, it's considered a gift from God. And hopefully we have time to explain that. So my mom sends me be me, okay? I'm going through all this stuff, and I'm still going through it in the sense that if I go out and drink a half a bottle of whiskey, I probably could get in a fight because that's what alcohol does. I mean, if you take away women and alcohol, you wouldn't have any fights except for UFC, Yeah. I mean, because that's what causes all of it. But But if I had too much alcohol, it's very likely if there was drugs and cocaine around, I'd do it if I had too much, because that's what happens. So anyways, all this, I'm going through all this stuff. I find out that I'm reading about all the truths about the Catholic faith, especially the Mass. And here's this lady, my mom sends me, and she predicts and has the stigmata. And this famous investigative journalist and his crew film her, not just having it, predicting it 2 months in advance. And if I can, David, I don't know how many listeners or who's listening, but regardless if you're religious or non-religious, I want you to go to a website. It's called Science Test, and test is plural, like, TESTS. So sciencetestfaith.com. Again, sciencetestfaith.com, and go to the About tab. You'll see me, and you'll see the actual video that my mom sent me. You can watch this. Nothing like this has ever been filmed in human history. So this lady has a stigmata. They filmed the whole thing from beginning until end.
Which Tim, as you were going to say, explain are the wounds of Christ, which that's why it's a gift. You were saying it's a gift.
Yes, and say that again, what you want me to do.
Yeah, explain why is it a gift.
Okay, I got you. Absolutely. Okay, so Jesus Christ essentially said, if you want to follow me, come after me, pick up your cross and follow me, right? And Colossians 1:24, by the way, Paul says he's getting beaten in prison. And this is just one example in the Bible, okay? But in Colossians 1:24, he said, I rejoice in my sufferings, and he's getting beaten in prison. He said, I rejoice in my sufferings for your sake. And he said, in my sufferings, I complete what is lacking in Christ's sufferings, in Christ's affliction. And he said, that's for the body, the church. Now, in simple terms, it works like this. When we suffer, Christ is the head. So if your listeners can picture, just picture a human being where you have a head and you have a body. So picture that in your head, a head and a body. Christ is the head, and the body is believers that are connected to Christ. And if your back hurts, your head knows about it, right? If your finger hurts, your head knows about it. You stub your toe, your head knows about it. And so in a very mystical way, when we suffer, now somebody doing the stigmata, believe it or not, asks for this. They're called victim souls. They say, I want to suffer with you, Christ, yes, so that I can help other people. So when we suffer, if we give it to Christ at the Mass, which I'm sure we'll get into, then Christ is able to take that suffering, God is able to take that suffering and use it to help other people. I always tell people, if you like to help people, which I think most people do, when you suffer, because everybody's going to suffer, some physical, some mental, some, psychological. If you take that suffering and you bring it to a Mass, Christ takes that suffering and it helps other people in the body of Christ. In fact, if you believe in heaven or hell, and if you don't believe in heaven or hell, you haven't lived in my world where I've practically seen hell, right? And seen demons. But when you suffer, you can actually, like my mom prayed and brought her suffering all the time to the Mass, and it can save souls from hell. Now, by the way, a person once said, what makes you think you can live like hell and go to heaven? And that struck with me because I live like hell. I remember I was driving and I was on drugs, and it was 6 o'clock in the morning. I was at an all-night club partying, and somebody gave me some ecstasy, I think. And it was about 5 or 6 in the morning, and I fell asleep driving. And I flew off the road, and I was literally, David, about 10 feet from a bridge, maybe 20 feet. I was about 5 feet from a pole. I woke up way out into a field going 55, 60 miles an hour. No way I should be alive. The tow trucks couldn't even get to me. And I look back and I say, that's the power of a mother's prayer. Because if I would have died then, if there is such a thing as hell, which I of course believe there is, I have a book in front of me called The Truth About Hell. You can't live like hell and go to heaven. I think I would have went to hell if not for the power of a mother's prayer.
I say the same about myself, and I think there are many people listening who can say the same thing. Well, that's all we have time for today. Don't forget, you can listen back to this program or previous programs on my podcast, Finding Happiness, on YouTube and Spotify. I look forward to having you back with us again this time next week. So for now, good night and God bless.